This week on Morning Mika, disgraceful.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
But I want to take a moment to talk about the president that I know. As the first Black, openly queer White House press secretary, and I gotta add, a proud Haitian American. For those who don't know, I can tell you that representation matters to him. Our voices matter to him. Our perspectives matter to him. And our success in our community matters to him.
That was White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre talking about her Haitian roots and the example set by the current commander-in-chief. On the other side, you saw it, Donald Trump stoking lies about legal immigrants. Anything to distract, I guess, from the debate? Sagging poll numbers, felony convictions? I'm Mika Brzezinski, along with Simone Sanders Townsend and Huma Abedin. I guess that's it, guys, this attack on a community of legal immigrants. And it seems so cruel and diabolical. I'm finding it difficult to comprehend. I know it's hard to continually be shocked, but I am. Is it a disgusting distraction because Kamala Harris has soared to a record 6-point lead in a recent poll? The debate was definitely tough on him. No serious person can argue he won that debate.
Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. So let's be clear about that. And clearly he is having a very difficult time processing that. And I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies, because it's a really interesting thing to watch. You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. His former chief of staff, a 4-star general, has said he has contempt for the Constitution of the United States. His former national security advisor has said he is dangerous and unfit. His former Secretary of Defense has said the nation, the Republic, would never survive another Trump term.
Yeah, it was definitely bad. We know crowd size is an obsession for Trump. Are Kamala Harris's crowds and her celebrity endorsements upsetting to this man? Yet, what is this response, this nasty response? Is this a strategy? Because it feels like the politics of subtraction, as Secretary Pete Buttigieg framed it. Cats, dogs, geese, Laura Loomer. Look, now he's attacking Taylor Swift like the last season before a show gets canceled for getting over the top and at the same time boring. This election is about jobs, wages, climate, healthcare, abortion. Not his show, your life. But Trump's distractions cause real damage, and Springfield, Ohio, obviously, is a case in point. We're seeing it happen in real time. Bomb scares, forcing kids out of the classroom, police patrolling elementary schools, the state's Republican governor pleading with Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, to stop. What Donald Trump isn't talking about is the many Haitian immigrants, particularly women, who have risen to great heights and service in this country. For example, Karine, the daughter of Haitian immigrants who came to the U.S. when she was just 5 years old. She often cared for her siblings while her dad worked as a taxi driver and her mom a home health aide. Karine, of course, would go on to become our first Black and openly LGBTQ person to serve as White House press secretary. Or how about Septima Poinsett Clark, the Haitian American, an educator and civil rights leader whose citizenship school helped drive one of the largest voter education initiatives for Black Americans in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. frequently referred to her as the mother of the movement. And don't forget about Marie St. Fleur, who emigrated to the U.S. from Haiti as a child. She would go on to attend Boston College Law School and in 1999 became the first Haitian immigrant elected to state office. What about, by the way, NBC News' own award-winning journalist, Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor? Her parents immigrated here from Haiti. Yamiche spoke out when Trump called her ancestral homeland an S-hole country back in 2018. Quote, "It reminded me I don't have the luxury to check out sometimes. There will be people who will remind me that. Hey, we sent you to the White House to ask questions for everybody." And she continues to do that every day. Thank you, Yamiche. Or what about in Springfield? Bernadette Dorr, a pastor at the First Haitian Church, and Mia Perez, an immigration lawyer. Despite threats as a result of Trump's lies and inflammatory rhetoric, the two recently joined in a prayer walk in support of their Haitian immigrant community. And Bernadette continues to hold services at her church. And I want to talk about Markenzie Lapointe, the first Haitian American U.S. attorney who is in charge of the prosecution of an alleged assassin whose apparent plot against Trump was foiled by Secret Service agents at his golf course in West Palm Beach recently. Markenzie was born and raised in Port-au-Prince. His mom worked as a street vendor, and his dad was a tailor. He worked his way through school as a cab driver and server. He also served as a U.S. Marine reservist and was called up to serve during the Gulf War. Incredible people who have overcome so much and continue to serve our communities, to serve us. And yet the Republican nominee for president using legal migrants, including Haitians, as political weapons.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is
the people on television say my dog was taken and used for food. So maybe he said that, and maybe that's a good thing to say for a city manager.
I'm not taking this from television.
But the people
I'm
on
taking it from
television
the city
saying
manager.
their dog was eaten by the people that went there.
Again, the Springfield city manager says there's no evidence of that. Vice President Harris.
The truth is the vast majority of Haitians in Springfield are in the U.S. legally, under temporary protected status, legal. And research shows they actually help the economy. By the way, back in the early 90s, I traveled to Haiti to see firsthand the struggle of the Haitian people as the U.S. rushed badly needed aid to the desperate people there.
When you talk to the people here, they'll tell you the presence of the American troops have given them a sense of freedom, security, but their sentiments are lined with one perpetual anxiety.
Simone, what's scary is a new poll from YouGov that shows a majority of Trump supporters believe the claim about Haitian immigrants abducting and eating pet dogs and cats. How do we combat this misinformation so late in the game? How does the campaign, how does the press do a good job at getting correct information to the American people in this environment?
You know, Mika, the J.D. Vance obviously knows that when he first uttered this lie, that it was in fact a lie. But he did a press avail with reporters and gave the woman's name. Her name was Anna Kilgore. He said, go, you can ask her. Go to her house. The journalists did ask her. Wall Street Journal reporters went to this woman's house in Springfield, and they found that her cat was there and that she was apologetic for making up this story, and they printed it. So I do believe that on this particular story, the media apparatus collectively is doing what it is supposed to do. Challenge challenge these candidates, particularly Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, because when they are telling blatant lies, and then go and expose the truth. The problem is, Mika, everyone can see the truth, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump included, yet they are choosing to make it up anyway. J.D. Vance even thinks that he finds it okay, saying that, you know, he's putting the media onto an issue that has been an issue for people all over this country for a while, and I find that quite disheartening. And people should be grateful for the words of Vice President Harris earlier this week, but also the words of Governor DeWine of Ohio, the words of the Republican mayor and the Republican elected officials in Springfield, in the state of Ohio, who have been willing to stand up to Donald Trump. But I'm just as deeply concerned about the Attorney General of Ohio, who has also parroted these conspiracy theories and these lies. So the reality is that, look, those people that believe the poll, the majority of folks who are supporting former President Trump, it is because they believe what he says, because it doesn't cross their mind that someone who's a former president of the United States would tell them blatant lies. And that, to me, just goes to show how little respect he has for the people who support him.
It also shows the poisoning of our politics. As you said, he's choosing to make it up anyway. Vance is choosing to make it up anyway. And there are Republican leaders and there are Trump supporters who are choosing to let this go by, even though people are getting hurt. And this could get worse. So that callousness, that poison, as I put it, I wonder, Huma, what does this tell us about a potential second-term immigration agenda if Trump were to win?
Well, it is very clear that Trump's vision of America is a white America. And in fact, it's not just about making up lies, as both you and Simone just pointed out. It's the sowing doubt. You just heard when David Muir tried to correct him and say the city manager didn't say that. This woman's cat has been found. It's like, well, we'll see. It's the constant sowing of doubt, even when it's a fact that's challenged. And to me, it reminds me of 2016 and the Muslim ban that he said he was going to institute on day one, which, by the way, he did. And it affected 7 Muslim-majority countries. And then in a panic, we saw all these attorneys racing to airports across the country as people were trying to enter this country legally and were threatened with not being allowed entry. And this feels even more insidious. I think the fact that he's identified this community in Springfield, 15,000 Haitian Americans, it actually puts a target on their back. And the final point I will make, because it's about the economy in the end, and people saying, in addition to all the other horrific things related to racism, I remember being in an Uber in 2016, and I think I've shared the story with both you and Simone, and being with a driver who was an immigrant to this country, and he says, oh, I agree with Trump that we should be shutting down the borders. I don't want someone taking my job. I came here legally. So it's this threat to people who are here, to their jobs, and then number two, and if they come in, they're going to hurt us. It is only going to get significantly worse if this man wins in November.
You know, this strategy of dehumanization and the other is the foundation of Trump's. I mean, he started a birtherism with Obama in his first campaign for the presidency that he won. And I just wonder, Simone, what this means for the Republican Party. I mean, we want a Republican Party, don't we? I mean, this isn't a Republican Party. What we've got right now, and I'll just say it, is a bunch of lunatics and people who are too scared to step up to them. A bunch of lunatics, psychopaths, okay? People who want to be cruel to win. And if you disagree with me, look it up. Look up how he talks. Look up what he says. Look up what he's done. Get the video of January 6th out and take a look at it, because he told them to do that. It will be wild. Show up. I'll be there to meet you. He tried to undermine the results of the election. He was fine with them hanging Mike Pence. No, this is him. And so this is the Republican Party. Right, but the Republican Party is succumbing. And so I guess the question is, if you're a real Republican and you don't want this for your party, and quite frankly, as a Democrat, I don't want this for the Republican Party. I would rather there be a strong, conservative Republican Party in that exchange of ideas. How then does somebody who is a Republican leader step up right now without being beaten down by Donald Trump? Is there a place for that?
Mika, I think people have to find the courage. And I go back and I think about Cassidy Hutchinson often and Sarah Matthews, because these are two young women. Cassidy Hutchinson specifically, who has exhibited more courage than the men that she used to work for. She was an assistant in the White House, and her testimony is part of the reason that accountability was on the horizon for Donald Trump in the first place. Republican leaders have to be willing to speak out. I remember in 2015, 2016, I worked for Senator Sanders in 2015, and I remember when it was very clear that he had lost the Democratic primary. He did not receive enough delegates. And the campaign was over. I had since left the campaign. But there were people with whom I had worked with, supporters of Senator Sanders, who were saying that Secretary Clinton stole the election, who said that the DNC rigged the election for Secretary Clinton. And I remember very vividly, actually, I went on MSNBC with Alex Witt at the time before convention, and I said, no one stole the election. I worked for Senator Sanders. He lost fair and square, and it is dangerous for us to say that. People did not like that I stood up there and said that to my former colleagues. But it was important to do so, because when people are spewing falsehoods, especially falsehoods that could lead down a dangerous path, truth must be spoken. And for the Republicans who do not agree with what Donald Trump is saying about, getting rid of all the immigrants in the country, all the bad immigrants, quote unquote, because that's what he's saying, who don't agree with it, who don't believe that it will happen, I encourage you to take a stroll down memory lane to see what it is he said he wanted to do in his last term. And then take a peer ahead and just imagine if he will implement any of the things that he's actually saying. This denaturalization process is something they tried in the first Trump administration already. Olivia Troy, who is a real Republican, if you will, spoke at the Democratic National Convention this year, who said Republicans need to stand up and support Kamala Harris and Tim Walz because Donald Trump is so bad. She came on our show The Weekend about 2 weeks ago, and she said she was in the White House and overheard a conversation of Stephen Miller and others talking about taking citizenship away from people. This is not hyperbole. And the only way it changes, Mika, is if people make a decision to be better.
And step up. I want to close by asking you both what you think Kamala Harris should be doing right now. But let me just finish that thought with George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice and other top tier, that would be the top Republicans. I'm begging you to come out in support of Kamala Harris. You can say, it is easy to say, I don't agree with any of her policies, none. But this is about something different. This election is about saving our democracy. And for that reason, that is why I'm casting my vote. We need everybody to step up. And if you have a position of power in the Republican Party, do not squander it right now, because we're trying to hold on to something here that will slip away very quickly if Donald Trump wins the next election. So for both of you, Huma, I'll start with you. What do you think Kamala Harris should be doing between now and Election Day, especially to counter the barrage of disinformation, the lies?
I think she needs to continue to do exactly what she's been doing, that she did brilliantly at the debate, which is calling it out in real time, calling the nonsense and the falsehoods out in real time, simultaneously talking about what she is going to do, what her agenda is, what her plan is for the country. I think she has run a near perfect campaign since she's officially become the nominee. But as the child of, I came from a family of Republicans who voted for Ronald Reagan and then for George H.W. Bush. And to watch the video, I don't know if either of you saw the video that was that has been posted about Reagan saying, and I want to quote him, and he said that this is a land, this country is a refuge to people who yearn to breathe freely. And he mentioned being supportive of Jews, of Christians, and he said people from Cuba and Haiti. And to now fast forward to your point, this is a party that doesn't exist. They have to start from scratch, and there's no time sooner than now to be supporting a campaign that's just trying to speak the truth and and at least have a fair shot at putting forward a proactive agenda, which the Harris-Walz campaign is trying to do.
Simone.
Yeah, Mika, I can't agree more vigorously with Huma. Vice President Harris and Governor Tim Walz are going to have to continue to run their race while expanding their tent. And I don't think the campaign is taking anything for granted. I know folks see all the excitement out there, but this is a close election. And this is an election that's going to be one on the margins. And what she did at the NABJ, the interview she did with NABJ journalists this week, I think that is something that the campaign should continue to replicate across the country, because it was a long form exchange where she was asked very pointed questions, gave very pointed answers. And when asked about reaching out to Black men specifically, given some of the recent NAACP polling about Black men voters and Donald Trump, the vice president said, well, I don't think Black men should just give their vote to anyone. And I'm working to earn the votes of Black men, just like I'm working to earn the votes of everyone else in this country. And I think that's something voters need to hear. And we'll see. People have already started voting in Pennsylvania and more states to come. This is going down to the wire.
Well, let me tell you, I appreciate you both being on this week. It is, and we're going to continue to cover it. And I'm thinking, like, let's switch things up. I'd say, Simone, next time, do you want to do what I do? You do me, I'll do you. We'll switch places. Do you want to do that?
We'll switch. It's like Freaky Friday. Okay, we'll do that.
Yes. Okay, and then Huma, and then Jen when she's back. It's going to be fun. That does it for Morning Mika. We'll be back soon on YouTube and Peacock, and next time, Simone will host.